What if I told you the end of everything doesn't start with fire in the sky, but with a question inside your head? Because what's truly scary isn't the world ending out there. It's realizing that everything you love, people, dreams, plans, can disappear without warning, and then the chaos hits. If everything ends, what's the point? If God exists, why the silence? And if God doesn't exist, what's left of us? Today, we're going to face disturbing ideas from the West and the East about existence, God, and meaning. This isn't a comfortable video. It's a video to wake you up. When we hear about the end of the world, our mind usually jumps to global disasters, volcanoes erupting, nuclear war, climate change reaching a point of no return. But what if the real end of the world isn't an explosion, but an inner collapse? Not an event, but a spiritual shift. That's the question major philosophical and religious traditions have been trying to answer for thousands of years. For Friedrich Nietzsche, the end of the world already happened, not in a fiery apocalypse or a final judgment, but quietly, when modern life killed God. In The Gay Science, he delivers the famous line, "God is dead, and we have killed him." But Nietzsche isn't talking about the literal death of a divine being. He's pointing to something deeper, the loss of meaning. The God that dies is the symbolic structure that used to give purpose, morality, and direction to Western life. As science advanced, Enlightenment reason grew, and modern individualism took over, the old certainties collapsed. Suddenly, the world no longer had an absolute moral center. And when that happens, the world doesn't end from the outside in, it ends from the inside out. The crisis is spiritual and existential. The modern person without God now has to create their own values. Nietzsche called this nihilism, realizing there's no objective meaning, and risking a life where nothing feels like it truly matters. So the question isn't only whether the physical world will end, but whether our world of meaning has already ended, and what we'll do about it. Will we sink into hopelessness, or will we be able to, like Nietzsche's Overman, create new values, new meaning, new ways of being? While Nietzsche sees the end as a collapse of meaning, Buddhism sees the end as a natural part of life's flow. The Buddha taught a simple but radical truth. Everything is impermanent. Everything is born, grows, changes and dies. There is no absolute end, only endless cycles of transformation. The Buddhist concept of anicca, impermanence, shows that the world is always dissolving. Every moment we live already carries the seed of its own ending. What looks solid is actually an illusion. Nothing lasts. Nothing stays. But the most unsettling part is that this also applies to the self. Buddhism rejects the idea of an unchanging soul. What we call me is just a collection of sensations, thoughts, and memories that constantly shift. So when the world ends, what ends exactly? Something that was never fixed in the first place. In that Buddhist view, the end of the world isn't a tragedy. It's freedom from attachment. Suffering appears when we resist change, when we try to hold on to what's meant to pass. Accepting impermanence is the path to peace. In that sense, the end isn't the end. It's just another wave in the ocean of existence. And maybe the real apocalypse is our desperate need for things to last forever. In Christianity, especially in the book of Revelation, the end of the world is described as a great end times event. Wars, plagues, trumpets, final judgment. But the word apocalypse in Greek literally means revelation. So the biblical end of the world isn't only destruction, it's unveiling. Masks fall, truth is revealed. The righteous are separated from the wicked. Evil is defeated, good triumphs, and human history, which seemed chaotic, is shown to be part of a divine plan. The apocalypse, then, is both physical and spiritual. It represents final justice, where every human action is measured, weighed, judged. It's a powerful, emotionally intense idea. Our choices matter, and there is a higher order guiding everything. even if we don't fully understand it yet. But here's the provocative thought. What if that judgment is already happening? Not as an external event, but as an ongoing inner process. In a way, our days are full of small apocalypses, moments of crisis where we're forced to face who we really are. If we look at history, every civilization has had its own apocalypse. The Roman Empire fell, the Middle Ages ended, modernity brought light, but also shadows, world wars, economic collapses, climate crises. Today, many people wonder, are we approaching a real end? From an environmental perspective, Earth is at a critical point. Climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean pollution, everything points to a possible collapse, maybe even an unavoidable one if nothing changes. But what most people don't notice is that before physical collapse comes spiritual collapse, and maybe that one is already happening. We live in an age of existential emptiness, anxiety, misinformation, and loneliness. People lose faith, not only in God, but in institutions, in politics, in the future. It's possible we're living, as Nietzsche said, in a post-God world, but we still haven't found anything strong enough to replace what was lost. We lost the old meaning, but we haven't created the new one yet, and that leaves us vulnerable, like civilizations without a soul. But an ending can also be a beginning. Christian revelation ends with a vision of a new Jerusalem, a city of peace and wholeness. Buddhism teaches that after the end of attachment comes nirvana, and Nietzsche believed that after the death of God would come the birth of the free spirit, capable of creating new paths. So maybe the end of the world isn't something to fear, but something to understand. Not as a sudden explosion, but as a transition, a mirror that shows us who we are. Maybe we're being invited to leave behind old ways of living and discover a new way to be in the world. More conscious, more clear-eyed, more real. Do you think the end of the world will be a physical tragedy or a spiritual transformation? Have you ever felt your inner world collapse? How did you rebuild meaning after that? When everything around us falls apart, a loss, an illness, a breakup, the collapse of a dream, we're confronted with a question that doesn't scream, but still hits hard. What's still left of me? That quiet, unsettling question has run through centuries of philosophy, because when everything goes, our body, our memories, time, other people, is there something in us that remains? Is there a self that survives the end? Or does it vanish along with everything else? To look for an answer, we have to cross borders, from modern Europe to the spiritual heart of India, from empirical thinking to existentialism, from being to its dissolution. Let's start with the Scottish philosopher David Hume, one of the most radical voices in modern Western thought. In a treatise of human nature, Hume throws out an idea that shakes our most basic intuition. When I look inside what I call myself, I always run into a perception. Heat or cold, light or shadow, love or hate, pain or pleasure. I can never catch myself without some perception. In other words, for Hume, the self is an illusion of continuity, like a flame that looks steady, but is constantly being replaced every second. So what are we then? Just a bundle of passing perceptions, thoughts, sensations, memories, without a fixed center holding them together. We're like a stream of experiences, but with no solid river underneath it. And when those experiences stop, through death, forgetting, or unconsciousness, the self disappears with them. That view can feel cold, but it also has a freeing side. If we aren't an unchanging essence, then we're free to change, rebuild, and start over. At the same time, it reminds us how fragile we are. If the self is only a collection of experiences, then the end of everything may also be the end of us. On the other side of the world, in ancient India, the philosopher Shankara, the key figure of Advaita Vedanta, also questions the existence of the self, but with a mystical depth rather than skepticism. For Shankara, what we call the individual self, ego, personality, body, mind, is Maya, illusion. The true self, with a capital S, isn't this me that suffers, wants, and ages. The true self is Brahman, infinite, eternal consciousness that fills everything. Brahman is real. The world is unreal. The individual self is not different from Brahman. Shankara. In Advaita, when everything ends, when personal identity dissolves, what remains isn't nothing, but everything. The separation between me and the world, between subject and object, falls away. The end of the ego is actually a return to the source, to what was never born, and therefore can't die. This philosophy doesn't deny personal experience, but it says it's temporary, passing, like a dream at night. When we wake up, what's left? Not the dream character, but the awareness that dreamed. Deep down, Advaita invites us to look beyond our identity, beyond our thoughts, our name, our story. Because when all that ends, something still remains. The one who observes, silent, eternal, untouchable. And then we arrive at Jean-Paul Sartre, the major French existentialist of the 20th century. For him, human beings don't have a fixed essence. We aren't born with a ready-made identity. We build ourselves over time through our choices. For Sartre, the self isn't something you discover, it's something you create. And that creation never stops. We live as a project. We plan, act, decide. We are freedom in motion. A person is nothing other than what they make of themselves. Sartre. Existentialism is a humanism. But that freedom has weight. If the self is a project, then the end of time is the end of the project. When everything ends, death, the end of a chapter, the loss of direction, the self as a construction ends too. The difference is that for Sartre, this isn't simply a tragedy, it's radical responsibility. Each of us has to build a self that makes sense while time allows it. And knowing everything ends doesn't weaken life, it intensifies it. These three views, Hume, Shankara, and Sartre, aren't just abstract ideas. They become real when we go through major ruptures. When we lose someone we deeply love. When an accident changes us forever. When we get sick or betrayed, or fall into the emptiness of a world that feels purposeless. In those moments, the question returns with force. What's still left of me? For some, like Hume, the answer is harsh. Nothing remains beyond the flow of experiences. For others like Shankara, it's a chance to go beyond the ego and return to the divine essence. And for Sartre, the end is the natural limit of a project that was always our responsibility. There's no single answer, but maybe the beauty is right there. The fact that we can think, choose, and even create what remains before everything ends. The end doesn't have to be a black hole. It can be a mirror. Because when we ask what's left of us when everything collapses, we're also asking what truly matters. Are you your body, your career, your memories, your faith, your awareness? Or is it the relationship you built with other people? The courage you showed on the worst days? The clarity you found while carrying loss? Maybe what's left of us isn't only something inside, but something between, in the impact we leave on others, in the ethics we lived by, in what stays standing even when everything else falls apart. There are moments in life when everything that once felt solid starts to dissolve. Loss, death, the collapse of certainty. When we hit those extremes, a quiet but crushing question shows up. Does the end reveal the truth? Or does it just destroy it? That doubt is deeply human, and it runs through thousands of years of philosophy. In times of crisis, disillusionment, or face-to-face with death, we're forced to look at what we usually avoid in everyday life, the truth about ourselves, about time, and about what really matters. This is the territory where thinkers like Plato, Dogen, and Heidegger walk, each offering an answer that's different, but revealing in its own way. For Plato, the end, especially death, isn't erasure, it's a passage. In his dialogue, Phaedo, he suggests that the human soul is trapped in the body like a bird in a cage, and that only through death does the soul finally become free to see truth in its pure form. As long as we have a body, and our soul is mixed up with this imperfection, we will never fully have what we desire, the truth. Phaedo for Plato. Truth doesn't live in the visible world, but in the world of forms, eternal, unchanging, and grasped by the mind. While we're alive, we're surrounded by shadows, opinions, and illusions. But when the soul is released from the body, it's no longer dragged around by passion, the senses, or the confusion of physical life. The end of the body becomes the beginning of clear vision. That helps explain why, in Phaedo, Socrates meets his own death with calm. For him, dying is waking up, and in that awakening, the soul finally reaches what it always wanted but could never fully see: the good, the beautiful, the true. But that view carries a heavy question. If truth is only fully reached after death, what does that say about life? Are we all just waiting for the end to finally understand? Or can we move closer to truth while we're still here? In Zen philosophy, that obsession with a final truth is actually the biggest obstacle. For the Japanese master Eihai Dogen, founder of the Soto Zen school, the idea that there's some ultimate truth to arrive at is a form of attachment, and attachment creates suffering. Don't seek the truth, just let go of your opinions. Dogen teaches that truth isn't at the end, and it isn't hidden somewhere far away, after death or after years of struggle. Truth is now. It's the present moment, lived with full attention, without the split between subject and object. That's one of Zen's biggest shifts. It doesn't hand you truth as a concept. It gives you practices that reveal reality directly. Meditating, breathing, walking, eating, everything becomes a chance to be fully present. And when you're truly in the now, you don't need truth as an idea anymore, because you're experiencing reality without filters. And here's one of Zen's most radical points. The search for truth can push you away from it, because searching implies it's missing, far away, separate from you. Zen insists it was never missing. We were just distracted. For Dogen, the end doesn't reveal or destroy truth. The end, like the beginning, is simply another moment. Truth isn't hidden in the end. It's hidden in whatever you're living right now, if you're awake enough to see it. If Plato sees death as liberation, and Dogen sees it as the dropping of attachment, Heidegger sees death as the ultimate mirror. In Being and Time, he introduces the idea of being toward death, the awareness that we are finite beings, always moving toward an end. But that awareness isn't meant to create despair. It's meant to wake us up. Death is not an event at the end of life. It is a constant possibility. Heidegger says, most people live in what he calls inauthenticity, distractions, routines, other people's opinions, desires that aren't really ours. We live as if life is endless. But when death becomes real, when someone close dies, or we face risk ourselves, we get a chance to live more authentically. In that sense, death reveals the truth of who we are. Because when you're forced to face it, everything superficial falls away. What's left are the essential questions. How have I lived? What have I avoided? What do I love? What was I too afraid to try? For Heidegger, death isn't just an interruption. It's a call to real life. So what is the end? A mirror or an abyss? With these three perspectives, Plato, Dogen, and Heidegger, we're invited to see the end not just as an event, but as an existential experience. For Plato, the end reveals a truth that was always beyond the body. For Dogen, truth is in the present, and chasing it in the end is getting lost on the path. For Heidegger, the end wakes us up to life. It doesn't give answers, but forces us to live our questions with honesty. But what does this mean in real life, when we're facing the end of a season, a phase, a relationship, a dream, an old version of who we thought we were? Truth can be brutal. Sometimes the end reveals nothing. It only shows that we were living in an illusion. Other times, the end makes us see who we really are. or what truly mattered once everything else is gone? How many people only understood someone's value after losing them? How many only started living urgently after a diagnosis? How many discovered their faith, their courage, their art after their world collapsed? So the end can be revelation or it can be loss. It depends on how we choose to face it. We live in a universe where everything ends. People die, civilizations fall, stars explode, planets grow old. Even our deepest beliefs get tested by time. And in the middle of all that, a question bothers even the most faithful. If God exists, why allow the end? If God is all-powerful, all-knowing and loving, why the pain, the collapse, the suffering? Why does everything have to end? This question has echoed since ancient times. It runs through religious, philosophical, and spiritual traditions from west to east. Three perspectives help us see the shape of this doubt. Augustine, who saw purpose even in the end. Krishna, who taught that everything dies so it can be reborn. And Epicurus, who questioned whether the idea of God makes sense in a world full of suffering. For St. Augustine, one of the major Christian theologians and early church thinkers, history isn't random chaos. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and everything unfolds under God's gaze and will. In The City of God, Augustine argues that there are two cities in conflict: the city of man, marked by selfishness, decay, and sin, and the city of God, spiritual and eternal, meant for the righteous. Human history, with all its endings and collapses, is part of a larger plan of redemption. The world is not without direction. God, who is eternal, rules with justice. Me, St. Augustine. From this view, the end isn't a divine mistake. It's a necessary point in a story meant to purify, reveal, and rebuild. The final judgment isn't just destruction, it's revelation and justice. The pain we experience, as hard as it is to understand, is often seen as the way God calls us back to what really matters. But there's a challenge here. This explanation requires faith. Faith that even in the absurd, there's meaning. Faith that even in loss, there's purpose. And that kind of faith is not easy to hold on to when you're staring at grief, injustice, or the destruction of what you love. In many Eastern traditions, especially Hinduism, the view of the end looks different. Instead of a straight line with a beginning, middle, and end, the universe unfolds in cosmic cycles. Nothing dies in an absolute way. Everything returns. Everything is reborn. In the Bhagavad Gita, a central Hindu text, the god Krishna advises the warrior Arjuna, who is in crisis as war approaches. Arjuna hesitates to fight his own relatives, but Krishna reveals a deeper truth. Just as a person throws away worn-out clothes and puts on new ones, the soul leaves old bodies and enters new ones. Bhagavad Gita, Chapter 2. For Krishna, destruction isn't the end. It's transition. Like fall making room for spring. Form breaks down so essence can continue. In Hindu thought, the end is part of Shiva's cosmic dance. Shiva, the destroyer, not as cruel, but as a force of renewal. Without destruction, there's no space for the new. The universe moves through an eternal cycle of creation, Brahma, preservation, Vishnu, and destruction, Shiva. This changes how we deal with loss. It's not a punishment. It's the natural movement of life. And God, in this view, doesn't stop the end, because the end is also sacred. But not everyone accepted these explanations. Over 2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher Epicurus offered a challenge that still hits hard today, what we now call the problem of evil. If God wants to prevent evil but can't, then he isn't all-powerful. If he can prevent it but won't, then he isn't good. If he can and wants to, why does evil exist? Epicurus. That logic cuts deep. If there's a perfect God, how do we explain suffering, tragic endings, early deaths, natural disasters? Why would an all-loving, all-powerful being not step in? For Epicurus, the best answer was to rethink the whole idea of divinity. He suggested that if gods exist, they don't care about human affairs. Or, more radically, that they don't exist at all. And what if that's true? What if the end happens because there's no one to stop it? No hidden plan, no secret meaning, no heaven waiting. Just an indifferent universe, moving by its own rhythms, without emotion, without justice. That view is harsh, but it also carries a strange kind of freedom. If no meaning is handed to us from above, then we're responsible for creating it. If God is absent, then our ethics, our values, and our compassion become even more urgent. These three perspectives force us into a difficult choice. Believe the end has a purpose, even if we can't see it right now. Accept the end as part of an eternal cycle where nothing is lost, only transformed. Or face the end as proof that we're alone and that everything depends on us. History is full of examples that can be seen through these lenses. The fall of the Roman Empire was disaster for many, but it also opened space for new cultures and new ways of thinking. World War II was a moral collapse of humanity, but it also pushed deep ethical reflection, like Hannah Arendt's work, and the rise of human rights movements. The recent pandemic brought massive grief, but also reignited conversations about solidarity, mental health, and the value of a simpler life. So the end can be a scream, a silence, or a seed. It can be emptiness or revelation. It all depends on where you're looking from. And today, in a time marked by global breakdowns, climate crisis, inequality, wars, technological disasters, Epicurus's question returns with force. If God is watching all this, why do nothing? At the same time, millions of people, like Augustine, believe there's a bigger plan even when everything feels lost. Others, like Krishna, see destruction as a doorway, and others, like Epicurus, no longer wait for God to fix anything and take responsibility for doing good here and now. So why would God allow the end? Maybe because the end isn't the opposite of creation, but part of it. Maybe because the end isn't the opposite of love, but what reveals who truly loves. Or maybe because God doesn't prevent the end, but walks with us through it. And if there is no God at all, maybe the end reminds us of what matters most. We're still here, breathing, questioning, choosing. When we face an ending, whether it's the end of a life, an era, or a dream, one quiet question shows up. Was it fair? The desire for justice has followed humanity since the earliest myths. We want to believe good will be rewarded and evil will be punished. We want to believe there's some order behind the chaos. But is there? Is the end a punishment, a correction, or just a fact? This question divides philosophical and spiritual traditions. For Kant, there's a rational demand for justice, but it goes beyond this world. In Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism, justice is karmic, built up over lifetimes, where the end isn't a final stop, but a consequence. For Albert Camus, the universe is deaf to our requests for justice, and that demands a new kind of courage, living without guarantees. Let's walk through these three paths. For the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, it's not enough to act morally. We also need to believe justice is possible. He wasn't talking about blind religious faith, but about a rational requirement of practical reason. In Critique of Practical Reason, Kant argues that for morality to truly make sense, we have to assume three ideas: that we are free to choose, that the soul is immortal, that God exists as the one who guarantees moral justice. Morality inevitably leads to religion. Can't. Why? Because in this world, justice doesn't always happen. Good people suffer. Cruel people succeed. If reality ends here, morality can feel pointless, like an empty sacrifice. That's why Kant argues it's rational to believe in a moral horizon beyond this life, where good is finally rewarded and evil is finally met with justice. For Kant, the end is not punishment or randomness. It's part of a larger moral structure, even if we can't see it, like a scale that keeps weighing things even after death. This view can be comforting, but it asks something of us. Do the right thing even when there's no visible reward. It's the ethics of duty, doing what's right because it's right, not because we'll get something back right away. So the end becomes a door. For some, an arrival. For others, maybe a correction. But for everyone, it's a passage. In Buddhism and Hinduism, the end is just one piece of a cycle, not a conclusion. Nothing truly ends. It just changes form. Karma isn't mystical punishment coming from outside. It's a law of cause and effect. Every thought, word, and action creates consequences, sometimes in this life, sometimes in others. Just as a shadow follows the body, karma follows the being. Dhammapada. From this view, there's no absolute injustice. If something happens, it has causes, even if we don't understand them. Suffering. It may be the result of past actions. Happiness. It may be the fruit of accumulated goodness. And this can apply to individuals, communities, and even civilizations. But here's the key. Karma isn't revenge. It isn't a cruel force that gets you back. It's simply consequence. Just like planting orange seeds won't give you apples, harmful actions won't produce peace. So the end doesn't erase the causes. In a way, it's the harvest of what was planted. If there's pain, it has roots. If there's peace, it has a story. And most importantly, karma is alive in the present. So even if the past was chaotic, you can still change direction, starting now. In this view, cosmic justice isn't guaranteed by a judging deity, but by the natural order itself. People reap what they cultivate. So the end isn't punishment or randomness, it's outcome. But Albert Camus invites us into a different kind of courage, and maybe the most unsettling one. What if there is no justice at all? In works like The Myth of Sisyphus and The Rebel, Camus starts from the experience of the absurd. We search for meaning, justice, explanations, and the universe doesn't answer. It simply exists. The absurd is born from the confrontation between the human call and the silence of the world, or Camus. In that silence, children die, genocides happen, good people are forgotten, and tyrants live comfortably. There's no moral logic, no heavenly court at the end. The universe doesn't punish, doesn't reward, doesn't care. That can sound hopeless. But for Camus, it can also be freeing. If the universe is neutral, then it's on us to be just. If life doesn't come with built-in meaning, then we're free to create it. If there's no guarantee of justice, then doing good becomes an act of clear-eyed rebellion. He uses the myth of Sisyphus, condemned to push a boulder up a mountain forever, only for it to roll back down each time. And Camus concludes, even without a happy ending, the absurd hero is the one who doesn't quit, the one who finds dignity in resisting, in creating beauty even in emptiness. For Camus, the end has no built-in meaning, and that's exactly why our existence can matter. Because knowing the end is neutral, we still choose to love, care, fight, and think. No illusions, no guarantees, just courage. So these three views answer the same question in very different ways. Kant believes justice exists beyond this world, guaranteed by God. The end is part of a moral order. Karma teaches that everything produces consequences, and the end is just the echo of what came before. Justice is part of nature itself. Camus says there's no guaranteed justice. The universe is indifferent, and we're the ones who must choose to be just. And all of this touches something deep in us, because we've all asked, why do bad things happen to good people? What did someone do to deserve this pain? How can evil win and walk away? Where is the justice? These aren't just philosophical questions. They're human. They show up at a friend's funeral, at the end of an unfair love story, in the collapse of a dream that felt meant to be, in the suffering of innocent people in distant wars, or in our own silence when it feels like the world has turned its back on us. So we come back to the question, is the end punishment, justice, or neutrality? Maybe. It depends on how you look at it. If you believe in a divine plan, maybe the end is a painful pruning so something more just can grow. If you see karma as a natural law, Maybe the end is simply the reflection of the seeds that were planted. And if you see the universe as indifferent, maybe the end is just a period that challenges you to write something meaningful before it arrives. But in all cases, one thing stays the same: how we live before the end matters. If everything ends, love, bodies, empires, even stars, what's the point of going on? If nothing lasts, why do we value anything? Why care, love, build, hope, fight? If time takes it all away, that doubt is real, and a lot of the time, it shows up quietly, after a loss, in a crisis, or when you look around and feel like everything is slipping through your fingers. But even in the face of endings, some people still say, life is worth it, not despite impermanence, but because of it. Thinkers like Viktor Frankl, the Chinese sage Laozi in the Tao Te Ching, and the German pessimist Schopenhauer all went deep into this question. Each one, in their own way, says, life has value, even if everything ends, and maybe, especially, because it ends. Imagine being trapped in a concentration camp. Everything has been taken from you: freedom, family, dignity. What's left? Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, lived that reality. And there, at the edge of suffering, he found something powerful. A human being can endure almost any pain if they find meaning. Life never stops having meaning, even in suffering and death. Viktor Frankl, man's search for meaning for Frankl. Life isn't valuable because it's easy or eternal. It's valuable because it can be filled with meaning. And that meaning isn't handed to you from the outside. You build it through your choices. He describes 3 ways to find meaning: through work or creation, what you put into the world; through love, what you live in relationship with another person; through suffering with dignity, when you can't change the situation, you can still choose how you respond. Frankl showed that even in the most extreme situations, when everything seems lost, life can still shine with dignity. Not because it lasts, but because it matters. Every moment lived with responsibility, love, and purpose is precious. Finiteness doesn't cancel value. Finiteness intensifies it. On the other side of the world, long before Frankl, a Chinese sage named Laozi also reflected on what makes life valuable. But his path was different. He didn't talk about meaning in the Western sense. He didn't push resistance or control. He taught the opposite: let go. In the Tao Te Ching, Laozi says everything is part of a larger flow, the Tao. The Tao isn't a god in a traditional sense. It's the way things move, the rhythm of the universe, the cycle of nature. Fighting it creates suffering. Moving with it is wisdom. Life is a flow. If you fight the current, you get exhausted. If you flow with it, you find peace. Tao Te Ching for Laozi: life's value isn't in control, achievement, or big goals. It's in living the present moment with simplicity, lightness, and harmony. Accepting that everything ends isn't a tragedy, it's a calm truth. Just like seasons change, just like day becomes night, life passes too. And that doesn't remove its value, it's what makes it beautiful. Taoism is almost the opposite of the modern impulse. Don't chase huge achievements. Don't try to make moments last forever. Just live this moment, fully present. Flow like water. It doesn't fight, it goes around. It doesn't demand, it nourishes. In impermanence, the Tao teaches, there is peace if you stop clinging. But not every philosophy is optimistic. Arthur Schopenhauer, a 19th century German philosopher, might be one of the darkest voices in the history of ideas. For him, life is basically suffering, and that isn't an exception, it's the rule. Why? Because what drives us is desire. We want to eat, love, win, be recognized, be happy. But desire never fully settles. When we get something, we quickly want something else, and if we don't get it, we suffer. Life swings between pain and boredom. Schopenhauer: the world as will and representation. That can sound hopeless, But Schopenhauer offers a different path. Want less. Not in the sense of giving up on life, but in the sense of seeing life with clear eyes. Influenced by Buddhism, Schopenhauer saw value in things like compassion, recognizing the suffering of others as connected to your own, aesthetic contemplation, art as a temporary escape from craving, the denial of the will, reducing blind desire as a way to reach deeper peace. For him, life becomes more bearable when you step out of the chase for pleasure and find a quiet kind of inner stillness. It's not a happy answer, but it's an honest one. And for many people, it's strangely freeing. 3 paths, 1 emptiness. Frankl, Laozi, and Schopenhauer are answering the same question. What makes life worth living if everything ends? And each gives a direction. Frankl, find meaning, even in pain. Laozi, release control, flow with the present. Schopenhauer, see the illusion and desire less. Maybe none of them is fully right on their own. Maybe all of them have something to teach us, because at different times in life, we need different kinds of hope. Sometimes we need meaning to keep going. Other times we need lightness so we don't sink. And there are days when all we can do is accept and breathe. Strangely enough, the fact that everything ends might not destroy value. It might create it. If we knew everything lasted forever, would we care as much? What makes a sunset special, if not the fact that it disappears in minutes? What makes a conversation unique, if not the fact that it will never repeat in exactly the same way? Finiteness pushes us into presence. Impermanence teaches us to look more carefully. Life is worth it precisely because it slips away. When we think about the end, we usually picture a specific moment, an explosion, a collapse, a final goodbye. Like the end always comes with noise and a date on the calendar. But what if the end isn't a single moment? What if the real end starts quietly, almost invisibly, and drags on for days, months, even centuries? What if the end is actually slow erosion, working from the inside, and we only notice it when it's already too late? This question, haunting in personal crises and in history, shows up in 3 powerful perspectives. Zygmunt Bauman, who describes the end as a dissolving process in liquid modernity. Buddhist tradition, which points to attachment as the root of inner decay. Oswald Spengler, who saw the end of civilizations as a natural, biological, inevitable cycle. Let's dive into these views, because maybe the end isn't what arrives, but what slowly sneaks in. Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman gave us a strong concept for understanding the modern world: liquid modernity. In this liquid era, nothing stays solid for long. Relationships, institutions, identities, values, everything feels fluid, slippery, unstable. In liquid modernity, the end is rarely announced. It happens drop by drop. Zygmunt Bauman. For Bauman, the end isn't a clear dramatic event. It's a chain of small, quiet breaks. Not a sudden fall, but a slow breakdown of meaning. We stop trusting institutions. We thin out our bonds. We shorten our attention spans. Love turns into a quick connection. Politics turns into a show. Truth turns into just an opinion. Everything keeps moving, but without roots. That's what makes this kind of ending so dangerous. We don't realize it already started. The house is still standing, but the foundation is rotting. Society is still breathing, but emotionally it's on life support. Identity still exists, but it's more and more fragmented. For Bauman, the end doesn't happen. It drags, and while we wait for the big collapse, we miss the small daily deaths. A friendship that cools down without a fight. An ideal that disappears in the rush. A democracy that gets sick from the inside. The warning is clear. The end won't be announced. It may have already started, and it may be happening right now. In Buddhist tradition, the end also isn't something outside. It's an inner process. It's not the world that ends. It's our attachment to it that breaks us. The Buddha taught that everything is impermanent. We suffer because we try to hold on to what can't stay. Attachment makes us fight the natural flow of life, and that resistance is where suffering begins. Everything that has form is bound to disappear. The end begins when we refuse to accept that. Buddhist teaching. But Buddhism goes further. Decay starts in the heart. It begins when we feed obsessive desires, selfishness, anger, vanity, when we cling to rigid identities, unrealistic expectations, toxic relationships, when we refuse to accept change. On the outside, life can look the same, but inside, it's already falling apart. And the more we resist, the more we suffer. So the end isn't a sudden explosion. It's untreated attachment, an unhealed wound, a truth avoided for too long. Buddhist practice invites clarity. Observe, accept, let go. To see that the end only terrifies us when we refuse to admit that everything flows. Oswald Spengler, a 20th century German historian and philosopher, offered a shocking theory in The Decline of the West. Every civilization has a life cycle. Like a living organism, it's born, grows, blooms, ages, and dies. Civilization is the inevitable fate of culture. When the spirit is exhausted, only the form remains. Oswald Spengler. Spengler didn't see history as steady progress. He saw it as a biological cycle. Creative, spiritual cultures eventually become rational, technical, bureaucratic civilizations. Over time, symbols lose power. Art repeats itself. Faith becomes an empty ritual. Power becomes mechanical. Then, the soul of a civilization fades. It doesn't collapse all at once. It withers. The fall isn't a bomb. It's a long sigh. Rome didn't fall in a day. It hollowed out over centuries. And Spengler believed the West was on that same path. A slow ending already underway. What makes his view even more unsettling is the inevitability. Spengler didn't believe decline could be stopped, only understood. The thinker's job isn't to save the day, but to watch the sunset. There's a tragic beauty in that. Knowing everything ends isn't a reason for panic, but for dignity in the face of death. So, is the end an event or a process? All three views meet on one point. The end doesn't have to be a catastrophic moment. It can be quiet, everyday, internal. But they also differ. For Bauman, the end is sociological, modern life dissolving into instability. For Buddhism, the end is psychological and spiritual, attachment corroding the present. For Spengler, the end is historical and inevitable, a culture's spirit running out. And each one touches a different part of our experience. When the world feels like it's lost depth, maybe we're living in liquid times. When you feel empty inside, even when everything is fine, maybe attachment has blinded you. When culture starts repeating itself without a soul, maybe we're in the winter of a civilization. And what about personal life? This isn't just about society or spirituality. It applies to us too. How many relationships ended long before the goodbye was ever said? How many passions died before anything officially ended? How many times have you been physically present but already gone inside? The end rarely knocks on the door. It slips in. It takes little pieces of us. It settles into silences, distances, routines with no heart. So the big question is, are we noticing the signs of an ending that already started? Or are we living like everything is still whole? A slow ending has one advantage. It gives us time. Time to change, to heal, to rebuild. If we can see that something is dying, maybe we can save what matters. Maybe the end is also an invitation to wake up, a call to be present, a chance to look inward before the collapse becomes total. Imagine that, all of a sudden, everything you believed in loses its meaning. Values fall apart. Promises stop ringing true. Words feel empty. There's no direction, no purpose, just a void. That's the territory of nihilism, the existential feeling that nothing truly matters. It's like standing on a stage after the play ends, but the lights are still on, and you realize The set was made of paper. The lines were rehearsed. And no one is watching anymore. So the big question is nihilism the end of everything or the beginning of something new? Thinkers in both the West and the East have tried to answer this anxiety. 3 stand out. Nietzsche, who saw nihilism as a crisis, but also as a possible rebirth. Nagarjuna, who taught that emptiness isn't denial, it's freedom. Seuren, who faced nihilism with brutal honesty and showed how clarity can become paralyzing. Let's look at each one, because when we stare into the void, we might discover not the end, but the space for reinvention. Nietzsche. Nihilism as a crisis and a bridge. Friedrich Nietzsche was one of the first philosophers to name modern nihilism clearly, and he didn't celebrate it, he warned about it. In works like The Gay Science and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche talks about the death of God, a symbol of the collapse of the religious, moral, and metaphysical certainties that held the West together for centuries. God is dead. We have killed him. The Gay Science. With that death came nihilism, a deep crisis of meaning. Without an absolute truth, everything starts to feel like it has no real value. There's no longer good and evil handed down by divine authority. No guarantee of purpose, just emptiness. But Nietzsche doesn't stop there. For him, nihilism is a bridge. Yes, it's dangerous, because it can lead to apathy, despair, and self-destruction. But it's also a rare opportunity, the chance to create new values. You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. Thus spoke Zarathustra. Instead of treating the void as the end, Nietzsche points to the figure of the Übermensch, often translated as overman or beyond man. Someone who, facing collapse, has the courage to create, to live by their own principles, with intensity, with love for life on earth, with freedom. For Nietzsche, nihilism isn't for the weak, it's for those strong enough to reinvent, to burn, fall, and rise again, to stop depending on ready-made absolutes, and live like a work still being built. Nagarjuna. Emptiness as freedom, not negation. In Buddhism, we find a different, but equally deep, response to nihilism. The Indian philosopher Nagarjuna, 2nd century, one of the key figures of the Madhyamaka school, built his teaching around one central idea, shunyata, emptiness. But be careful, emptiness here is not nothingness. It's not total absence. It's not the denial of meaning. It's freedom from clinging to fixed essences. All things are empty, not because they don't exist, but because they have no fixed independent nature. Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna invites us to see that nothing exists on its own. Everything exists through relationships, through interdependence, which means everything is always changing. The mistake is trying to hold the world as if it were permanent. Suffering shows up when we insist that things, and even ourselves, have a fixed, stable, eternal self. When we understand emptiness, we don't lose meaning, we gain lightness. Unlike some Western forms of nihilism that treat the void as collapse, Nagarjuna shows emptiness as an open space where anything can arise. It's not the end of truth, it's the end of rigidity. It's not the fall of value, it's liberation from the illusion of absolute value. From this view, nihilism only becomes destructive when we confuse emptiness with nothingness. But if we understand emptiness as possibility, it can become a doorway into wisdom. Seuren. Nihilism as a cliff. Then there's Emil Seuren, maybe one of the darkest thinkers of the 20th century. Born in Romania, he wrote with sharp clarity about nihilism, anxiety, and existential boredom. For Seuren, nihilism isn't a bridge, it's a cliff. Not freedom, but too much lucidity. To feel the absurd is to become lucid, and to suffer because of it. Seuren. For him, the problem isn't just that God died, it's that we see too much. We see contradictions, emptiness, the endless repetition of life. And the more we think, the more we notice. Everything is temporary, everything fades. So nihilism doesn't only destroy beliefs, it destroys will. Without purpose, action becomes hard, desire becomes painful, and writing, loving, creating starts to feel like pushing against the absurd. But Sioran wasn't just cynical. He found a strange beauty in bitter clarity. He wrote like someone trying to turn despair into art, like someone looking for a way not to go insane, while knowing there's no ultimate rescue. For him, nihilism isn't an opportunity, it's a diagnosis, but maybe a diagnosis that can be spoken with elegance, with irony, with silence. What do we do with the void? Three thinkers, three paths. Nietzsche says, nihilism is a crisis, but also creation. Nagarjuna says, nihilism is poison only when misunderstood. Emptiness is openness. Sioran says, nihilism is lucidity, and maybe there's no exit, only writing. All three stare into the abyss, but they answer differently. Nietzsche wants to turn the abyss into a stage. Nagarjuna wants to show the abyss is a mental trap. Sioran wants to sit at the edge of the abyss and write about it. And us. We live in an era where nihilism spreads in subtle ways. On social media, where everything feels performative and hollow. In political promises that keep breaking. In institutions that fail. In consumption without soul. In faith turned into a product. In too much information and too little meaning. It feels like we barely believe in anything anymore, and at the same time we don't know what to put in its place. We're surrounded by stimulation and starving for meaning, rich in technology, poor in purpose, connected, and still lonely. Nihilism isn't just a philosophy now, it's a shared feeling. It can be collapse, it can be paralysis, it can be vertigo that pulls us down, but it can also be a radical clearing out. A moment of silence where we finally hear what's real, where we drop what was fake and start asking deeper questions. Maybe, in the end, what makes nihilism either a fall or an opportunity is what we choose to do with it. Have you ever wondered, if nothing has meaning on its own, is creating meaning just fooling yourself? We live in an age full of doubt. A lot of people don't believe in absolutes anymore. Fixed purposes. Ready-made truths. Science tells us we're cosmic dust. History shows that values change. Technology pulls us apart, and social media can leave us feeling empty. So here comes one of the hardest questions. If the universe doesn't tell us why we're here, is creating a why just living a beautiful lie? Three major traditions have wrestled with this. Sartre, who says meaning is a choice, and that's exactly what makes it real. Zen Buddhism, which warns that making meaning can be just another trap of the ego. Pascal, who felt the universe's silence as a deep unease and offered faith as a courageous bet. Each one gives an answer, and maybe, where these views meet, we can find something that actually resonates. Sartre. Meaning as a true choice French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the founders of existentialism, starts from a simple idea. There is no built-in meaning. We aren't born with a fixed essence. There's no instruction manual for life. Human beings are thrown into the world and only later decide what they will become. Existence comes before essence. Sartre. In other words, first we exist, then we decide who we are. And the same goes for the meaning of life. It isn't out there waiting to be discovered. It's created in here, through our choices, actions, and commitments. But is that just an illusion? A story we tell ourselves so we don't fall into the void? Sartre would say, no, because for him, nothing is more real than a choice made freely. Even without guarantees, absolutes, or eternal foundations, what we bring into the world, our love, our projects, our art, is real because we chose it. Man is condemned to be free. Sartre. Condemned because we can't escape freedom, but also privileged because we can become the author of our own life. Creating meaning isn't self-deception. It's taking responsibility for your existence. And that responsibility is huge. No excuses. No, it's just the way things are. If we choose to love, to fight, to build, that becomes who we are. For Sartre, The real lie is running from that, living on autopilot, copying other people's values, pretending some outside destiny is deciding for us. So for him, making meaning is the most honest move a free person can make. Zen. Are you creating meaning or escaping the void? While Sartre celebrates the freedom to create meaning, Zen Buddhism pushes for a different kind of clarity. It asks, are you really creating meaning, or are you just trying to cover up your fear of emptiness? In Zen, especially in teachings linked to masters like Dogen and Hakuin, the search for meaning can become a subtle form of attachment. The mind wants safety, it wants control, it wants an explanation. But in doing that, it can drift away from what's real. Don't chase the meaning of things, live them. Zen teaching. Zen isn't saying nothing matters. It's saying that obsessing over meaning can pull us away from direct experience. Instead of fully living the present, we get lost in theories and explanations. We want to understand the ocean, but we forget to feel the water. Many Zen teachers would say, reality is right here, in this breath, in this sound, in this small gesture. It doesn't need to be explained. It needs to be lived with full presence. From this view, inventing meaning can become a polished distraction, a way to protect ourselves from impermanence, uncertainty, and the feeling of having no ground. But every protection can also become a prison. Zen's challenge is radical. Let go of the need for meaning, and you might find something deeper. Not an idea, but a presence. Not a why, but a how. Pascal. Faith as a courageous bet. Blaise. Pascal, a French thinker from the 1600s, lived long before existentialism, but he already felt the modern conflict. What if God doesn't exist? What if we're alone in the cosmos? Pascal wrote about this in his Pensées, Thoughts, and his conclusion is unsettling. The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me. Pascal. Unlike Sartre, who sees the void as freedom, Pascal sees it as anguish. He says human beings are a living contradiction, big enough to ask why, too small to answer with certainty. So he offers his famous Pascal's wager. When you're facing doubt and the abyss, it's better to bet that God exists. Because if God exists, you gain everything. And if God doesn't, a life with faith can still feel more dignified than a life stuck in despair. But this faith isn't blind. It's brave. It's the leap of an uneasy heart. Not because you're certain, but because you can't live inside the silence. Pascal recognized nihilism before the word existed, and he responds not with human construction, like Sartre, not with dissolving the ego, like Zen, but with trusting the mystery. Not trying to prove God, but opening yourself to the infinite, because the human heart wants more than reason can fully reach. So, is it a lie to create meaning? It depends on how and why you do it. If you create meaning just to distract yourself, to avoid reality, it can become an illusion. If you use meaning to control life, to freeze what's always changing, it can become attachment. But if you choose to live with purpose, even knowing everything is temporary, that's authenticity. The real question isn't whether meaning is guaranteed. The real question is, what do you do with the fact that it isn't? Sartre says, create. Zen says, let go. Pascal says, trust. Maybe the most honest answer is this: no meaning lasts forever, but that doesn't stop us from living with intensity, compassion, and clarity. Meaning may not be absolute, but it can still be ours. When we think about the end of humanity, we picture disasters, environmental collapse, nuclear war, unstoppable pandemics, AI spinning out of control. But behind those images, there's an even deeper question. Is humanity heading toward the end because that's just how things go, or because we're failing as a species? That question forces us to look inward, not just outward. More than tectonic plates or asteroids, maybe the greatest threat to humanity is humanity itself. Our choices, our habits, our neglect, our selfish decisions? This question crosses cultures and centuries. Three thinkers help frame the dilemma. Hannah Arendt, who saw the banality of evil and political irresponsibility as the real danger. Confucius, who believed decay begins when we lose virtue and moral order. Thomas Hobbes, who thought collapse is what happens when order breaks down and we slide back into chaos. Let's listen to these voices, because maybe the end of humanity isn't an unavoidable destiny. Maybe it's a mirror of what we've become. Hannah Arendt, The Danger of Ordinary Evil. Hannah Arendt, a 20th century philosopher and political thinker, wrote one of the most disturbing books of the modern era, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. In it, she analyzes the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the organizers of the Holocaust. But what she finds isn't a bloodthirsty monster. It's something even more frightening. A normal man, bureaucratic, obedient, unable to think for himself. Evil can be banal when it becomes routine, when it's done without reflection, without judgment. Hannah Arendt. For Arendt, the real danger to humanity isn't just violent tyrants. It's the crowds of people who stop thinking, stop questioning, and stop taking responsibility. When we give up critical thinking, empathy, and moral courage, we become part of the collapse. In this view, the destruction of humanity doesn't come from outside. It comes from ethical irresponsibility, and it isn't distant. It shows up in small choices. When we ignore injustice, when we follow absurd rules without thinking, when we repeat hateful narratives, when we choose comfort instead of compassion. So the end of humanity, here, could be moral, not marked by explosions, but by a quiet death of conscience. A world where everyone does what has to be done, but nobody asks if it's right. Confucius. Collapse begins when virtue disappears. Centuries before Arendt, the Chinese sage Confucius warned about the same risk, but in a different language. For him, a healthy society depends on individual virtue and social harmony. When rituals, customs, respect, and ethics are abandoned, decline begins. When ritual is lost, disorder takes over. When virtue is corrupted, society collapses. Confucian thought deeply values moral order, not an order forced through violence, but one built through respect, responsibility, wisdom, and justice. For Confucius, the end of humanity isn't heaven's punishment. It's the result of decades, or centuries, of moral erosion. When leaders are corrupt, parents don't teach by example, young people lose honor, and respect becomes rare, the human fabric tears. Civilization gets sick from the inside. Like a body that can't support its own organs, it begins to collapse. This isn't natural in the sense of being unavoidable. It's built through ethical neglect. For Confucius, hope rests on educating character. There's no real progress without humanity. There's no future if the soul of society has already died. Hobbes. Without order, we return to chaos. Thomas. Hobbes, a 17th century English philosopher, gives an even more radical view. In Leviathan, he describes the state of nature, an imagined condition with no laws, no government, and no social order. In that state, human beings fight each other to survive, and life becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes believed we escape that chaos only by creating a social contract, giving up part of our freedom to a higher power, the state, in exchange for safety and order. But that structure for him is fragile. If authority fails, if trust breaks down, we slide back into a state of war. So in Hobbes's view, the end of humanity is natural in the sense that collapse is always waiting in the shadows, not a divine curse, just what happens when human order breaks. And Hobbes wasn't a nihilist. He believed human reason can build peace, but it requires shared responsibility, limits on selfishness, and strong institutions. When fear, ego, or personal power overrides the common good, war returns, and with it, the end. So, moral failure or natural fate? These three thinkers, Arendt, Confucius, and Hobbes, show that the end of humanity isn't just a natural event like an earthquake. More than anything, it's a consequence of our moral and political choices. Humanity can end through neglect, as Arendt warns, through the loss of values, as Confucius fears, or through the breakdown of order, as Hobbes predicts. None of these views say the future is locked in. All of them suggest history can still change direction. But that takes something deep, shared responsibility. So the question isn't, when will the end come? It's this: are we living in a way that keeps humanity alive? And today, we live in a time when truth feels relative, empathy gets treated like weakness, politics turns into ego warfare, the planet is under pressure, technology moves faster than our ethics. Maybe we're living through warning signs of an ending. But it's not the end yet. We still have choices. We can still think, as Arendt demands. Bring back virtue, as Confucius asks. Strengthen order, as Hobbes hopes. The end of humanity isn't written, but it can be written by us. We usually fear the end of life, of relationships, of seasons and cycles. But what if, instead of fearing the end, we should welcome it as freedom? What if the end isn't just the collapse of what holds us, but the release from the pain that keeps pulling us down? Across different philosophical and spiritual traditions, especially Buddhism, the Yoga Sutras, and the work of Schopenhauer, there's a shared, deep message. Life, as we usually live it, is shaped by suffering, and the end of that suffering isn't a fantasy. It's possible. But to get there, we may have to flip the logic of the modern world. Maybe the real path to peace isn't getting more, but wanting less, not being in control, but letting go, not beating pain, but rising above it. Let's walk through these three views, because where they meet, there may be a healing kind of silence we haven't found yet. Buddhism, the end of suffering is possible. Buddhism starts with a brave observation. Life includes suffering. But this isn't a call to despair. It's the first step toward freedom. After reaching enlightenment, the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, which are the foundation of his teaching. Life contains dukkha, suffering, dissatisfaction, frustration. The cause of suffering is craving and attachment. The end of suffering is possible by ending attachment. There is a path to do that. The Noble Eightfold Path. It's the third truth that gives us the key. Yes, there is suffering, but it can end. And it doesn't end through some outside miracle. It ends when we stop desperately trying to hold on to what can't be held. We crave things, people, status, ideas, and all of it slips away. We suffer because we want the world to stay fixed, but it isn't. So the end here is the end of attachment. When we stop gripping, obsessing, and resisting change, something new appears. Calm. Suffering isn't mandatory. It's the result of a mind that refuses to accept life's flow. Freedom is accepting, and through accepting, changing. In this view, the end isn't death. It's waking up. It's the end of illusion, the end of the inner prison. It's the freedom that shows up when we stop trying to control what can't be controlled. Schopenhauer. The end of blind wanting. In the West, philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer reached surprisingly similar conclusions, but through a much darker view of existence. For him, to live is to desire, and to desire is to suffer. Life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. Schopenhauer, the world as will and representation. What he calls the will to live, that irrational force pushing us to want, chase, fight, and win, is also the source of pain. We want something. We suffer because we don't have it yet. We get it. And soon we're bored or scared of losing it. Happiness is brief. Frustration keeps coming back. Schopenhauer didn't believe the world had a redeeming meaning. To him, Suffering is built into existence. But there was still a path, not toward a fake happiness, but toward real inner peace. To deny the will. How? Through aesthetic contemplation, art, music, and philosophy can pause desire for a moment. Through compassion, seeing the same pain in others weakens the ego. Through ascetic living, simplicity, restraint, fewer cravings. The end here isn't a physical ending. It's the end of uncontrolled wanting. Freedom comes when we're no longer at the mercy of desire. And instead of living like a pendulum, we find a deep quiet. Not ecstasy, but relief. A yes to life. Not because life is easy, but because it no longer owns us. The Yoga Sutras. The end of mental turmoil. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, one of the core texts of classical yoga, the definition of liberation is clear and extremely precise. Yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. According to Patanjali, suffering isn't in things, it's in the restless mind. Thoughts, memories, cravings, fears, these pull us away from direct reality. The mind is like a shaken lake. It distorts the reflection of what's real. Liberation, called kaivalya, comes when the mind becomes quiet. When we stop swinging between past and future, wanting and rejecting, idealizing and fearing. It's a simple but deep proposal. Not controlling the world, but training the mind. Not forcing suffering away, but seeing clearly. Not searching outside, but becoming still inside. In this view, the end is the dissolving of mental disturbance. And what remains? Clarity, freedom, presence. Kaivalya isn't extinction. It's being whole, beyond the noise. It's the end of the illusion of separation, the end of ego identification, the end of control anxiety. One shared thread. When we place these three traditions side by side, Buddhism, Schopenhauer, and the Yoga Sutras, a common thread appears. Suffering is real, but it doesn't have to be forever. And the end of suffering doesn't depend on the world changing. It depends on the mind changing. Buddhism calls for ending attachment. Schopenhauer calls for denying blind desire. The Yoga Sutras point toward mental stillness. Each one, in its own way, shows that suffering comes from how we relate to desire, and that freedom is possible, not by miracle, by practice, by courage, by letting go. Modern culture usually pushes the opposite path. It praises desire as creative energy. It sells consumption as identity. It markets happiness as something you achieve. That's why these philosophies still feel so revolutionary. They tell us, you don't need more, you need less. You don't need to conquer the world. You need to stop losing yourself inside it. We live as if life were endless. We put off decisions, delay conversations, push our dreams to later. But later is a fragile promise. The only certainty we have, and the one we avoid looking at directly, is this: we're going to die. And it's exactly that certainty, this absolute limit, that can teach us how to live for real. When we don't deny it, death becomes a quiet teacher. It doesn't shout. It whispers essential truths. Time moves. Life slips away. Right now matters. And the way you live shows the way you die. Three traditions help shine light on this. The Stoic Seneca, who tells us to remember death as a way to live with more awareness. The Samurai Honor Code, Bushido, which turns acceptance of death into discipline, courage, and honor. Martin Heidegger, who says we can only live authentically by facing our finiteness. Let's walk through these ideas, because maybe death doesn't have to be a taboo. It can be a mirror. Seneca, remembering death to live. Clearly, Seneca, a Roman Stoic philosopher, practiced something that might sound morbid to many people. Memento mori, remember you will die. But for him, this wasn't dark obsession. It was a call to clarity. When we remember we're going to die, we start living with more focus, more courage, and less waste. You behave like a mortal in everything you fear, and like an immortal in everything you desire. And Seneca, Letters to Lucilius. How often do we waste time on pointless things? How often do we hold back words that need to be said? How often do we avoid living because we assume we'll have time later? Seneca believed awareness of death sets us free. Free from pride, from empty rushing, from collecting things that don't matter. It teaches us to separate what's essential from what's just noise, to value the present as a gift. For him, remembering death is remembering how precious life is. If you live like you'll last forever, you don't live deeply. But if you know you'll die, you start living like each day matters, like it's the last and the first. Bushido. Acceptance of death as discipline. On the other side of the world, the samurai code of Bushido turned death into moral discipline. For a warrior, death wasn't the opposite of life. It was part of how you live. The way of the warrior is acceptance of death, b. Hagakure, a Bushido text. As strange as it sounds, accepting death gave the samurai strength. He didn't fight with fear. He didn't hesitate when hard choices came. He didn't waste his days, because he lived like someone who had already died. That idea may sound extreme, but it carries real wisdom. When you accept the end, you stop trying to avoid every risk at all costs. You live with courage, with honor, with focus. Bushido valued integrity above survival. Better to die with honor than to live by betraying yourself. Better to stay true to your principles than to drag yourself through life in empty fear. And this lesson isn't only for warriors. It's for anyone facing challenges, moral dilemmas, outside pressure. When you know you could die at any moment, you stop delaying who you really are. Death teaches you to live without cowardice. Heidegger, finiteness and authentic life. German philosopher Martin Heidegger, in Being and Time, offers one of the deepest reflections on death. For him, death isn't just a biological event. It's the most radical possibility of being human. Because almost everything in life is uncertain, except the end. Being toward death is the condition for living authentically. Heidegger. Most people, Heidegger says, live in an inauthentic way. They repeat patterns. They avoid thinking about finiteness. They live as if they have all the time in the world. But when we face death, not as something far away, but as a real possibility that's always there, something changes. A new urgency appears, a raw truth, a deeper responsibility. Death calls us to authenticity. It forces questions like, what truly matters to me? Am I living according to my truth, or according to what people expect? If I died today, would my life have been mine, or just a reflection of the world around me? Heidegger isn't telling us to live every day like it's your last, in a cliché way. He's asking something harder. Live in a way that you could be ready to die at any moment, without the regret of never being who you were. Death as a mirror. Seneca, Bushido, and Heidegger all show that death doesn't have to be pure terror. It can be a mirror, a reminder, a strict teacher, but a fair one. It teaches us time is limited, and that makes it valuable. Honor, courage, and truth can't be postponed. Real living requires clarity, presence, and responsibility. As long as we run from death, we keep living like sleepwalkers. But when we face it, even for a moment, we wake up. And in that moment, life gets brighter. Colors return. Urgency wakes us up. Truth catches up with us. And today, we live in a culture that tries to hide death. Aging is treated like failure. Talking about death is taboo. We'd rather avoid it, distract ourselves, deny it. But that denial has a cost. We lose the chance to live with focus. We cling to what doesn't matter. We pretend we have time, and life passes by. Maybe it's time to change that, to bring death back into our imagination, to listen to what it teaches instead of running from it. As the ancient Stoics said, death isn't the end of life, it's part of it, and only those who understand that truly begin to live. We usually see the end as loss, absence, disappearance, but there's an older and maybe calmer view where the end isn't a cut. It's a return, not the collapse of something, but meeting the source again. This idea runs through mystical, philosophical, and spiritual traditions. The end isn't the denial of being. It's being gathered back to its center, a quiet return to what gave us life in the first place. Three voices, Plotinus, Taoism, and Meister Eckhart, help us see death, dissolution, the end, not as a break, but as rejoining the one. An end that doesn't erase, but reveals. An end that doesn't destroy, but strips away what isn't real. Let's explore this worldview where everything that is born is already on a path back home. Plotinus. Everything comes from the one and returns. At the heart of Neoplatonic philosophy is Plotinus, a 3rd century philosopher. He offered one of the most beautiful and metaphysical visions of existence. Everything that exists flows from a single source, the one. The one is beyond categories. It isn't a thing. It isn't a mind. It isn't even a personal God, like in many religions. It's the absolute source, pure simplicity, fullness without form. Everything comes from the one, and everything returns to the one. Plotinus, Enneads. For Plotinus, creation isn't mechanical or even a deliberate act. It's overflow. The one is so full that it naturally radiates outward, and from that radiance come intellect, soul, and the visible world. But as we move away from the one, we fall into multiplicity, fragmentation, forgetting where we came from. The human soul becomes, in a sense, exiled inside itself, trying to find again what was always behind everything. For Plotinus, the end of the human journey isn't annihilation. It's reintegration, the soul returning to the one, an ascent, a purification, a mystical rising back into absolute simplicity. The deepest end of life is meeting again what never stopped being our true essence. Death, in this view, is a return, not to matter, not to emptiness, but to the one, to the source, to the silence that existed before every form. Taoism. The wave returns to the sea. On the other side of the world, Taoism echoes a surprisingly similar idea. For Laozi, the author of the Tao Te Ching, everything that exists is carried by an invisible, eternal flow called the Tao. The Tao can't truly be named, because any name already limits it. It isn't a being, or a god, or an outside law. It's the way of everything, the flow of life and death, seasons and cycles, opposites and change. The Tao gives birth to all things. All things return to it. Tao Te Ching, Chamsi 34. In Taoism, birth is a temporary expression of the Tao, and death, the end, isn't a real ending, but the return of form to the formless, the end of a wave, returning to the sea. So wisdom isn't resisting the end, it's flowing with it, living lightly, simply, with presence, and dying naturally, like a leaf falling when it's time. Life is a curve, and the end of the curve is just the start of another cycle. Returning to the Tao is inevitable and freeing. There's no need for despair. Everything returns, and returning isn't losing, it's completing. Meister Eckhart. The end that matters is the death of the ego centuries. After Plotinus, far from the Yangtze River, a German Christian mystic appears with an equally radical view, Meister Eckhart. A 13th century theologian, he believed true spirituality isn't about gaining, it's about letting go. A person must let go of themselves, just as they must let go of all things, so that God may be God in them. Meister Eckhart. For him, the most important end isn't the death of the body, it's the death of the ego, the dissolving of the identity we pile up. I am this. I have that. I was hurt. I want. All of that has to die, because only when we lose everything can we find what's essential. For Eckhart, The end is a negative path, an unlearning. The more we empty ourselves, the closer we come to God, who, for him, isn't a separate being, but the silent depth of being itself. So the real return isn't to heaven or to the past. It's to the silent center within us, to the nothing that is somehow everything. In this sense, death becomes a symbol, a call, a reminder that life isn't about accumulation, it's about surrender, and that the end of illusions makes room for what is truly real. The end, as reintegration Plotinus, Laozi, and Eckhart say the same thing in different words. The end is the dissolving of form, but not of being. It's the release of whatever separated us from the whole. It's returning to the source, whether we call it the One, the Tao, or God. These views challenge us, because we live in a culture obsessed with permanence. We want to last, to fix, to label, to control. But maybe peace is exactly in returning, in letting go, in trusting that the end isn't loss, but fullness. What if birth is the start of exile, and death is the way home? We live surrounded by technologies that try to delay the end. We build stories of digital immortality. We try to hack aging, we fear silence. But deep down, it's all a fight against what can't be avoided. And that fight steals the present. It pulls us away from the deepest truth. Everything returns. Everything falls apart. Everything goes back to the source. And maybe the real mystery isn't what lasts, but what remains, even when everything ends. The word apocalypse usually brings up dramatic images: skies on fire, horsemen of destruction, earthquakes, stars falling from the sky. It's the end, total collapse, final judgment. But what if the apocalypse is already happening inside us? What if it's not only an external event, but an internal transformation? A crisis in the unconscious, a symbolic breaking point, a revelation of the soul. The word apocalypse, from the Greek apokalypsis, doesn't actually mean destruction. It means revelation. What was hidden shows up. What was covered gets exposed. That changes everything. Maybe the real apocalypse isn't the end of the physical world, but the end of a way of seeing, living, and ignoring. And in that ending, something new is born. 3 traditions help us rethink this idea. Carl Jung, who sees the apocalypse as a symbol of the unconscious demanding transformation. The Book of Revelation in Christianity, which mixes cosmic images with moral judgment. Buddhism, which says the true end is awakening, the collapse of ignorance, not the collapse of the world. Let's dive into these 3 views, because the apocalypse might be closer and more internal than we think. Jung, the apocalypse as inner transformation. Carl Gustav Jung, one of the biggest names in 20th century psychology, didn't treat religious symbols as literal events. He saw them as expressions of the collective unconscious. For him, the apocalypse is an archetype, a powerful image that points to an inner process, the breaking of the old and the birth of the new. The apocalypse is the eruption of the unconscious into consciousness, a confrontation between light and shadow. Jung, in times of major historical crisis, wars, pandemics, social collapse, the collective unconscious gets stirred up, and what was repressed, hidden, denied, starts to surface. That's why, for Jung, the apocalypse isn't only destruction, it's revelation. It's when the shadow, traumas, buried desires, shared fears comes into the open. This process hurts. It can feel like everything is falling apart. But in reality, it may be the psyche trying to reorganize itself. In this view, humanity goes through an apocalypse when it has to be reborn. And like every rebirth, it comes after pain, confusion, and darkness. For Jung, the apocalypse is symbolic, but not less real because of that. It shows up in dreams, unconscious decisions, and social breakdowns. The world might not end, but if our consciousness doesn't evolve, we'll stay trapped in a cycle of self-destruction. So the apocalypse becomes a call from the soul: change, or repeat the same collapse forever. The Christian book of Revelation: judgment and renewal. In Christianity, especially in the book of Revelation, the story sounds more literal and more terrifying. Beasts, trumpets, seals, angels, final judgment. A cosmic and moral drama where good is separated from evil, the righteous are saved, and the world as we know it ends. But even inside the violent symbolism, there's a central thread. The apocalypse is judgment. Yes, it reveals, but it also evaluates. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Revelation 21, part 1. This new heaven and new earth points to renewal. So even here, the apocalypse isn't only destruction, it's transition. Unlike Jung, who sees it as psychological and internal, the biblical view presents the apocalypse as a real future event, a final moment when human actions, sins, and choices are weighed. And that idea is intense. The end of the world is tied to the moral state of the world. If we're corrupt, selfish, cruel, the end becomes consequence. If we're faithful, just, compassionate, the end becomes salvation. For generations, this image worked like an ethical warning. Live right, time is short, judgment will come. Even if the language is symbolic, the message is direct. The apocalypse unmasks the world. And when everything is revealed, who will you have been? Buddhism, the end of ignorance, not the end of the world. In Buddhism, there isn't an apocalypse in the Western sense of final destruction. The universe isn't moving toward judgment. It moves in cycles: birth, death, rebirth. Everything turns within samsara, the cycle of conditioned existence. But there is an end, and it's deeply transformative. The true apocalypse, in the Buddha's teaching, isn't the collapse of the outer world. It's the end of ignorance. When ignorance is extinguished, suffering is extinguished, and what remains is freedom. Buddhist teaching. Here, ignorance doesn't mean lack of information. It means the illusion that things are permanent. It's attachment to the ego and to fixed identities. It's craving that traps us, aversion that consumes us, fear that blinds us. Awakening, enlightenment, is when the mind sees clearly. Everything is impermanent. The self is not solid. There's nothing to control. In that moment, something dies. But what dies isn't life, it's illusion. And what's born is freedom. That is the Buddhist apocalypse. Not the end of the world, but the end of blindness. Not the extinction of life, but the extinction of suffering. Is the apocalypse inside or outside? These three views push us to rethink. For Jung, the apocalypse is symbolic but deeply active in us, a call to transform the soul. For biblical Christianity, the apocalypse is real and future, a final crisis with moral judgment. For Buddhism, the apocalypse is the end of ignorance, an inner collapse that leads to awakening. But do we really have to choose only one? Maybe all three are pointing to the same truth, using different languages. What matters is this: the end reveals us. It shows who we are, what we believe, and what we're willing to change. And that applies to people and to civilizations. Maybe the apocalypse isn't an event with a set date. Maybe it's a process already unfolding, a cycle that repeats until we finally learn to see. Today, many people call our time apocalyptic. Climate crisis, collapse of values, wars, tech isolation, collective anxiety. But what is really ending? Is it the world? Or is it the version of the world we built, and that can't hold together anymore? Maybe the apocalypse isn't a curse. Maybe it's reality demanding awakening. God's silence has always been one of the deepest abysses in human thought. What if one day we look up, and there's no one looking back? What if moral order, justice, and meaning are just human inventions in an indifferent universe? That question, uncomfortable and dizzying, isn't new. It runs through the history of philosophy, literature, and religion. And it gets even stronger in modern times, when faith in God goes into crisis and other ideas fight to become the center of our lives. If God is absent or never was, what do we put in his place? Nothing. Absolute freedom, reason, nature, or a new kind of spirituality that doesn't require a personal God. Three thinkers from three different traditions help us explore this. Dostoevsky, who saw God's absence as a risk of moral collapse. The Buddha, who built an ethics without God, based on clarity and compassion. Spinoza, who redefined God as nature itself, not a separate being. Let's reflect on this together, because maybe the most important question isn't whether God exists, but what we do when we lose him. Dostoevsky, if God doesn't exist, is everything allowed? The most famous line linked to Dostoevsky echoes through his work. If God does not exist, everything is permitted. The brothers Karamazov. In that novel, Ivan Karamazov questions divine justice in the face of children's suffering, and he reaches a harsh conclusion. Without God, there's no final foundation for good and evil. The danger here isn't just theoretical, it's moral and existential. If there isn't an absolute point outside of us that says, this is right and this is wrong, then ethics becomes a personal choice. And personal choices, without anything greater to anchor them, can turn into pure arbitrariness. For Dostoevsky, the absence of God doesn't mean freedom, it means disorientation. You see this in characters like Raskolnikov, Crime and Punishment, who kills someone believing morality is relative, or Stavrogin, Demons, who becomes a portrait of modern nihilism, someone who lost faith and also lost the sense of everything. What replaces God in that scenario can be emptiness, and emptiness can turn into violence, selfishness, and madness. Dostoevsky wasn't just a moral conservative, but he felt that if we lose God, we need something equally strong to protect human dignity. Otherwise, the risk is a fall, not only of faith, but of the soul. The Buddha. Can you live ethically without God? But is it possible to live morally without God? Without heaven, hell, final judgment, or divine commandments? For Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, the answer is yes. Buddhism is one of the few spiritual traditions that doesn't rely on a creator God. In its core teachings, there isn't a personal God who punishes or rewards. There isn't a supreme being deciding what's right or wrong. And yet Buddhism builds a deep, sensitive, universal ethics. Avoid evil, do good, purify the mind. This is the teaching of all Buddhas. Dhammapada. For the Buddha, the root of suffering is ignorance and selfish craving. Freedom comes from clarity, from deeply understanding impermanence, interdependence, and the emptiness of a fixed self. Buddhist ethics doesn't come from fear of punishment. It comes from seeing that harmful actions create suffering, in us and in others. Compassion isn't a rule imposed by God. It's a clear response to real human pain. In that sense, what takes God's place is awareness. The moral standard isn't external, it's internal. It's an awakened heart, a clear mind, active compassion. Buddhism shows that you can live with responsibility, wisdom, and kindness, even without God. Because suffering is real. Life is fragile, and easing another person's pain can be meaning enough. Spinoza. God isn't absent, we just misunderstood him. Baruch Spinoza, a 17th century philosopher, went even further. He didn't deny God, he completely redefined what God is. For him, God isn't a separate being from the world, not an old man in the sky, not a moral judge, not a creator watching from the outside. God is nature itself. Deus sive natura, God or nature. Ethics, Spinoza. Everything that exists is an expression of the divine. The human mind, the body, the wind, the planets, ideas, logic, emotions, everything is part of one infinite substance. In Spinoza's view, God isn't absent. He's just not what many people imagine. God doesn't speak, punish, or reward. But God is present in every movement of reality, the principle of order, reason, and existence. So living well isn't about obeying a supernatural command. It's about living in harmony with the rational order of nature. Spinoza's ethics is built on understanding and inner freedom. The more we understand causes, the less we're controlled by blind passions. And the freer we become, the more capable we are of love, for ourselves, for others, and for the whole. Here, what replaces a personal God is a deep sense of unity. There isn't a heaven above. There is wholeness here and now. And to live well is to live in tune with that wholeness. When God leaves, what comes in? Dostoevsky sees a danger, moral emptiness. The Buddha offers an alternative, clear ethics without divinity. Spinoza rebuilds the idea God isn't absent, only misunderstood. These three views point to something essential. It's not God's absence that matters most. It's what we do with that absence. We can fall into nihilism and selfishness. We can wake up awareness and compassion. We can rediscover the sacred, not as someone else, but as the whole. Maybe the deeper question isn't, does God exist, but what holds your life together when everything guaranteed disappears? If there's no eternal reward, would you still choose kindness? If there's no invisible judge, would you still live truthfully? What replaces God doesn't have to be a new belief. It can be awareness. It can be presence. It can be responsibility for yourself, for others, for the world. There are moments in life when everything falls apart. You lose your footing, your direction, your connections. What once felt certain turns into doubt. What was yours disappears. And then, in the emptiness, a quiet question starts to echo. Who am I now? Not when everything is going well, but when everything is gone. In those moments, the end isn't a metaphor. It's real, and it forces us to face what we usually avoid: the fragility of control, the illusion of ownership, and the final test of our identity. But some people see it as a chance, a test, a kind of fire where everything superficial burns away and only what's essential remains. Three philosophical traditions think deeply about this. The Stoics, like Epictetus, who say loss reveals what is truly under your control. The Bhagavad Gita, which teaches, in the middle of collapse, act with courage, without attachment to the outcome. Kierkegaard, the philosopher of anxious faith, who says despair reveals the self's relationship with the eternal. Let's step into these ideas, because inside every ending, there's a revelation. Epictetus, what depends on you? Epictetus wasn't born free. He was enslaved in the Roman Empire. He lost his freedom, his youth, his rights, and still found something inside himself that no one could take away. The core of his philosophy is simple and powerful. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. Epictetus, Enchiridion. That distinction is the heart of Stoicism. Everything external, fame, money, health, approval, is not fully under our control. But what we think, what we choose, and how we respond to what happens to us is, to the Stoics, losing everything is not the end of dignity. It's the test of it. It's when you find out if you were clinging to the outer shell or rooted in the core. Imagine someone who loses everything: their job, their home, their sense of certainty. They can sink into despair, or they can say, like Epictetus, I can still choose my attitude. That's where the end becomes a revelation. You find out what is truly yours. And what is yours? Your courage, your reason, your ability to keep going, even when the world stops. The Bhagavad Gita, act without clinging to results. On the battlefield of Kurukshetra, the warrior Arjuna collapses. Facing an imminent war and seeing relatives and friends on the other side, he drops his bow, confused, shaken, desperate. And then Krishna, his charioteer and teacher, tells him, Act, but without attachment to the results. Do your duty without craving the outcome. This teaching is one of the pillars of Hindu philosophy, especially in the Gita. Act without attachment. Do what is right, even if everything around you is falling apart. Even if the world says, it's not worth it. Krishna doesn't deny suffering. He also doesn't promise victory. What he teaches is a kind of clear surrender. Act with focus, without becoming a slave to the outcome. This principle is called karma yoga, the path of right action. The Bhagavad Gita shows that even at the end, even in total collapse, human dignity lives in continuing to do what is just. Not because success is guaranteed, but because you're loyal to your inner truth. Arjuna didn't want to fight, but he fought, without rage, without hunger for glory, just with awareness. And maybe that's the greatest test of all. When everything collapses, do you still remember who you are? Can you still act with clarity, even when you can't control the result? Kierkegaard, despair, and the self's relationship with the eternal. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard went deeper than most into the pain of being human. For him, we live in constant tension, between the finite and the infinite, between the immediate and the eternal, between what is and what could be. And when that tension breaks, despair shows up. But Kierkegaard saw despair not as failure, but as revelation. Despair is the sickness unto death, but also the moment when the self recognizes itself. The sickness unto death. To lose everything, in this view, is to lose your masks, to stand naked before yourself, without roles, excuses, or illusions. And in that emptiness, either you run or you face the truth of who you are. Kierkegaard believed the true self is born in despair, when all external support disappears, when you fall and realize you can't hold yourself up from the outside anymore. Then either you turn toward your relationship with the absolute, with God, with eternity, with what transcends the immediate, or you get lost. Faith, for him, isn't calm certainty. It's a leap into the dark, a desperate and courageous act of trust, even when everything feels lost. The end, for Kierkegaard, is the moment the soul screams for meaning, and that pain can be the beginning of a new existence. When you lose everything, who do you become? Epictetus, Krishna, and Kierkegaard answer in different ways, but they share one thread. Loss doesn't destroy the self, it reveals what it is. For Epictetus, the test is recognizing what you still have, your inner choice. For the Bhagavad Gita, the test is acting with courage and detachment, even when everything collapses. For Kierkegaard, the test is despair, forcing the self to turn toward the eternal, or sink into nothingness. So the end isn't only destruction, it's a chance, a kind of silent courtroom where you finally meet yourself, and the question remains, are you still you when you lose everything? Or was everything you thought you were just scenery? We live trapped inside time, hours, calendars, deadlines, birthdays, clocks that never stop. But what if time had an end? What if, at some point, whether after death or in the collapse of the universe, time stopped making sense? What would exist after the end of time? Is there even an after? Or does that question already come from an illusion? Three major perspectives, one theological, one mystical, and one philosophical, face this question head-on. For Thomas Aquinas, time is not eternal, and eternity, far from being an endless timeline, is a completely different mode of existence. For Hinduism, time is cyclical. Everything is born, dies, and is reborn. The end of one cycle is the beginning of another. For Henry Bergson, real time isn't the time on a clock, but the time of consciousness. So the idea of an after depends on how we experience time from the inside. Let's dive into these ideas, because understanding the end of time might be the key to understanding the beginning of the eternal. When we think of eternity, we usually imagine an infinite line, time stretching on forever. But Thomas Aquinas, the medieval theologian and philosopher, said that's a mistake. Eternity is not endless time, but the complete and simultaneous possession of a perfect life. Summa Theologica. For him, God is not inside time. God is eternal, and eternity is not infinite time, but another order of being, where everything exists in an eternal present. Imagine a being that doesn't wait, doesn't age, doesn't progress. Everything is fully complete, all at once. So when we talk about eternal life after death, we're not talking about an endless chain of seconds and minutes. We're talking about an existence outside time, where there is no longer a before, during, or after. For Aquinas, time is a condition of creation. It's the rhythm of change. And when everything is fulfilled, when there is no more change, death, or growth, time will stop. So the end of time isn't nothing. It's the beginning of eternity. But that eternity isn't emptiness. It's fullness. It's finally being completely present. While the Christian view often sees time as having a beginning, middle, and end, Hinduism sees time as an eternal cycle. In Hindu thought, time is divided into great ages called yugas. Satya Yuga, the age of truth. Treta Yuga, Dvapara, Yuga Kali Yuga, our current age, marked by moral decline and chaos. Each yuga lasts thousands of years and is part of a cosmic cycle called the Maha Yuga. When a cycle ends, everything collapses, only to begin again. Just as days follow nights, the cycles of the world follow one another. Bhagavad Gita. Here, the end of time isn't an absolute shutdown. It's a return to the source, like winter that takes everything away, only to prepare for spring. Like twilight that isn't just an ending, but a transition. This changes how we relate to endings. There's no final despair. There's trust in return. Time doesn't drag us into an abyss. It brings us back to the starting point, which never stopped being the center of everything. So the question, is there an after the end, gets a new answer. Yes, but that after already existed before. Time is a cycle, and the end is just a curve. For the French philosopher Henri Bergson, the big modern mistake is thinking time is the same for everyone. He separates two kinds of time: quantitative time, measured by clocks and calendars; lived time, which he calls duration, la durée. Time as it is felt, from the inside. Real time is the time of consciousness, which flows, stretches, and contracts, something you can't divide into equal parts. Time and free will, essay on the immediate data of consciousness. For example, a minute waiting for someone can feel like forever. A great conversation can make an hour pass in a flash. Psychological time is flexible. It's emotional and qualitative. And for Bergson, it's more real than the time on a clock. So when we ask, what exists after the end of time? Maybe we should ask, after the end of which time? If clock time ends, if the universe collapses, consciousness might still exist. And if it does, time might continue inside it. In that sense, time doesn't end with the world. It ends with consciousness. And as long as there is consciousness, there is experience and some form of time. So the question, is there an after, depends on the consciousness asking it. And if consciousness can somehow go beyond death, time would be transcended too. Aquinas teaches that time can end, because eternity isn't a continuation, but a perfect present. Hinduism says time doesn't truly end. It restarts in cycles, like the universe breathing in and out. Bergson reminds us that time isn't only what we measure, it's what we live, and the existence of an after depends on the awareness of the now. These views don't have to cancel each other out. They can complement each other. Together, they show that time isn't absolute. It can be relative, subjective, divine, cyclical, psychological. And maybe its end is just an invitation to look beyond it. There are moments in life when no questions are left, except this one. Is it worth going on? When everything seems to have lost its meaning, When exhaustion feels bigger than hope, when plans fall apart, relationships collapse, and existence starts to feel heavy, the mind whispers or screams, "Why keep going?" This isn't a small question. It's the most basic question in philosophy, because every other question, what is good? Does God exist? What's the meaning of life? Only matters if we first decide to stay alive. Three major perspectives approach this question in a deep, life-changing way. Albert Camus, with his idea of clear-eyed rebellion, shows that going on can be an act of freedom. Zen, with its radical simplicity, teaches us to keep going without drama, one step at a time. Viktor Frankl, who survived concentration camps, reminds us that as long as meaning is still possible, there's a reason to live. Let's explore these answers, because if there's one question we should never ignore, it's this one. In The Myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus begins with a brutal statement. The only truly serious philosophical problem is suicide. For him, life is absurd. The world doesn't offer final answers. There's no ready-made script. Human beings crave meaning, but the universe responds with silence. That's the absurd, the tension between our hunger for meaning and the lack of guarantees. But instead of surrendering, Camus proposes something else, a clear-eyed rebellion. He uses the myth of Sisyphus, condemned to push a boulder up a mountain forever, only to watch it roll back down, as a symbol of the human condition. But instead of calling it pure punishment, Camus says, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because when Sisyphus recognizes the absurd and still keeps going, he wins a kind of inner freedom. He's basically saying, the universe won't give me meaning, but I'm still here. That's rebellion, not against the world, but against giving up. It's continuing by choice, not by illusion. It's turning awareness of tragedy into strength. For Camus, living is a creative act of defiance, and continuing is a way of claiming your freedom in the face of the absurd. While Camus offers conscious resistance, Zen Buddhism gives a different answer. Don't fight it. Just keep going. No drama, no big explanation, no need to justify your existence. When you're tired, rest. When you're hungry, eat. When it's time, walk. Zen teaching. Zen doesn't demand that life have a fixed meaning in order to be lived. It invites you to be fully present, not trapped in the mind that keeps debating the value of life, but grounded in the body that breathes, feels, and moves. This is a deeply practical approach. It doesn't deny pain, but it doesn't turn it into a theater either. It teaches that the mind, when it tries to explain everything, can create extra suffering. Life doesn't have to make sense in order to be lived. Sometimes all you need is one step, one breath, one honest moment of attention. The Japanese Zen master Dogen said, "To be present is to be awake. Practice itself is enlightenment." Meaning, even when you feel empty, even in chaos, there's wisdom in simply continuing. Without rushing for answers, without clinging to endings, just taking the next step. And in that quiet, aware walking, life finds its own rhythm, beyond despair and beyond hope. Viktor Frankl was imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps. He lost everything. But inside that horror, he discovered something no one could take from him: the ability to give meaning to his experience. In Man's Search for Meaning, he writes, "Those who have a why can bear almost any how." For Frankl, human beings don't live on comfort, they live on purpose. Even in the worst conditions, if there is a reason, a responsibility, a hope, then there is a reason to keep going. That meaning can take many forms. Loving someone, finishing a work you started, holding on to dignity in the middle of pain, being a witness to truth. He noticed that the prisoners who held up best weren't always the strongest physically. They were the ones who still had something inside that gave them a reason to continue. Frankl later created logotherapy, a form of therapy built on the idea that meaning is the central force in human life. And even when life feels meaningless for a while, he insists, a person can find meaning, even in suffering. For him, continuing is an act of responsibility toward life, not running away from pain, but answering it with courage. So when everything collapses, Is it still worth it? Camus, Zen, and Frankl don't give the same answer. But they all say yes, each one for a different reason. For Camus, continuing is freedom in the face of the absurd. For Zen, continuing means living without attachment to drama. Only this moment matters. For Frankl, continuing is a commitment to meaning, even at the edge. Together, they show that there isn't one universal answer. There is a personal decision made again and again, each new day, each new step. Continuing isn't automatic. It's a choice made in the dark, in silence, in the center of pain. But it's also where real freedom begins. And today, we live in uncertain times, hopelessness, global crises, chronic anxiety, a collective feeling of burnout. In moments like that, the question returns, is it worth going on? And maybe the answer doesn't come from the mind, but from the body that keeps breathing, from the heart that still beats, from the hand that helps someone else, from the small gesture that, even without a clear reason, holds life together. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. If this philosophical journey touched you in any way, if an idea clicked, challenged you, or gave you the strength to keep going, then it was already worth it. Now I'd love to invite you to be part of this space. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos, and of course, leave a comment below. Which of these ideas spoke to you the most? What lesson are you taking with you from here? And if you know someone who needs to reflect on the value of life right now, share this video. One shared idea can be a turning point for someone. Don't forget to hit like. It really helps the channel grow and reach more people who love philosophy and deep thinking like you. And before you go, stick around a little longer. There are other videos on the channel that can expand your mind even more, and maybe even change the way you see the world. See you in the next one.